The main business of the evening is to hear a lecture by Professor Helen Jarvis, who is Professor of Social Geography Engagement at Newcastle University. She gained her PhD from the London School of Economics in 1997, and her current research considers intentional communities of collaborative housing, alongside her enduring interests in gendered geographies of inequality and work-life reconciliation. She's published widely. Her books and publications include The Secret Life of Cities, Work-Life City Limits, Cities and Gender, and 2 local history publications, Salmon Fishing on the Tweed with Tessa Holland, and Women in Geography and Academic Discipline at Newcastle from 1928 with Grace Evie, and that is her topic for this evening.
Thank you for inviting me to contribute to your society programme today. I am not a historian. So the archival work that I've done to date, which I'm going to focus on today, is motivated by my enduring commitment to social justice and a feminist perspective in all that I do personally and professionally. So this is kind of a combination of the two. So the idea in the title here of Herstory, as it says, is to view history, in this case, the history of geography at Newcastle University, from a self-consciously feminist perspective, to highlight the overlooked but pivotal role of women told from a woman's point of view. So I'll begin this talk by reflecting on a project of work that I developed in collaboration with an undergraduate student intern in 2018. It also produced this book that was on the cover, and I've got a few copies of that for anyone at the end, called Inspirational Women of Geography's Past. Our aim was to uncover and reclaim the pivotal role that women played in the early development of my discipline, geography, which is a very, very broad discipline. A colleague of mine calls it the world discipline, which of course is very ambitious and grandiose. My social geography point in the subject is a very tiny part. But the aim was to uncover it at my place of work, Newcastle University, at a time in 2018 when we were celebrating 90 years of geography teaching here. The first undergraduate degree programme was taught in 1928 at what was then Armstrong College. Stories about the early development of geography, as an academic discipline, are largely told through the lens of societies, such as yours here, and indeed the one of this building. But I'm going to refer to the history of the Tyneside Geographical Society, which was launched in 1887 and ran pretty much to 1944. An annual lecture of that society still continues to this day, but the actual society folded in 1944. So representations of women, men, and gender, I would argue, really matter historically and in the present day in societies. And one of my provocations today is to encourage you maybe to think about the history of your own society, as we have done with the Tyneside Geographical Society. Because these historical records tend to be skewed to represent or misrepresent a male-dominant culture. In turn, this skews the type of knowledge that's considered to be valuable and whose ideas are influential and who the leaders are considered to be. So you look around you at the leaders in the Mining Institute, cultural norms of respectability and knowledge and expertise are deep-rooted and persistent. So for instance, here in the Mining Institute, because women have been so long and pervasively excluded from the mining sector, we have a constructed view of mining as men's work. And it's very difficult to imagine women performing physically demanding jobs in underground mines. But many of these men, illustrious men here, are not mine captains or mine leaders or geologists. So this is where we get the sort of need to explore and probe what is assumed and taken for granted by the recorded history of a particular society. So I firmly believe that every institution, society, and field of scholarship should work to expose historic sexism, racism, and unconscious bias in the stories and the voices that are represented. So while my talk begins in a discrete piece of 19th century archival work for my institution, I'm going to go on to highlight some contemporary issues, things that might take you into the field yourself. Geography as a field discipline, as I'm sure is antiquaries as well. You know, archaeology and history of places and spaces. So I'm going to encourage you to look at some of the contemporary issues of underrepresentation of women and marginalized groups in heritage collections and curation narratives, including, for instance, monumental statuary. So in this sense, my motivations to recover the herstory of geography are the same that drive my contemporary research on social justice, to challenge structural inequalities through a combination of activist methods and empirical projects. And there's arguably a place for activism in history, archaeology, antiquaries, heritage, and education. So in 2018, I employed undergraduate student Grace Heavey. I don't know where she is today, but she was a very good student. And my approach to education is to engage students in the research process as often as I can. And this poster that she produced at the time as part of her internship celebration offers a useful overview of what I call the hidden figures that we uncovered at the time. So I'm going to highlight the contributions of 5 women. The first, who I'm actually going to come to last, is Margaret Tyrrell, who none of you will have heard about. She's not in the historical record at all. I had to really dig deep into the university archives for her story, because she was pivotal in 1928 in the establishment of geography as an academic discipline at what was then Armstrong College. The 4 others, May French Sheldon, Josephine Peary, Alicia Buick-Little, and Mary Sheepshanks, they are all figures who spoke at the Tyneside Geographical Society, and we explored their stories sort of from the stepping off point from the lectures that they gave at the TGS from 1887. Some of you will probably know that the Robinson Library at Newcastle University has an extensive archive of Gertrude Bell. I don't quote Gertrude Bell today because she's very well known and she has a whole archive all of her own. Doesn't need to be reclaimed quite as much as the other women I'm going to mention today. But it's interesting to know that she also spoke to the Tyneside Geographical Society in 1907. And as I say, you can explore her story as well. Now, at this point, I was going to be able to, well, I wanted to introduce the Tyneside Geographical Society, but I was going to do so through this wonderful archive that we have, a living archive that we have in the Robinson Library, which is a bound attendance book that was set up by the founder members, and it records the names of all the visiting speakers and lectures that were delivered at regular public meetings. It is actually has been digitized and in a turning page software. So I would ordinarily be able to click onto this link and you can see the pages turn of this wonderful book, this leather-bound book. So the book itself is in the library, in the archives. It's been reconditioned and been preserved. But all the pages have been digitized in this turning page software. So you can actually turn through from 1887 right through. And we have actually been signing this book to the present day. And we'll send you a link so that you can actually explore that. So this is a really interesting living archive. It was the kind of cornerstone of what we did with this project. Because the Tyneside Geographical Society was established in 1887 by a group of Newcastle businessmen who were meeting regularly in a quayside restaurant. You know, it very much tells the story of many societies of this type, you know, Lions Corner houses and tea rooms, and a kind of it was very much an intellectual society, but it was also very pragmatic. It was about talking about industrial trading routes, putting Newcastle on the map. And the businessmen who were there had a geographic interest, which was very bound up with the region. It was a regional science society before it became more broadly associated with the experience of mountaineering and military life. And certainly once they started having popular lectures, they actually had their own little building with a lecture theatre. It's shown on the front of this booklet in St Mary's Place, long gone. The lectures were very popular, and they drew in particularly explorers, and it was very much a kind of boys' own adventures type theme of the lectures, how I would present it today. So you can explore this partial account of this once foremost regional scientific and educational institution yourself through the Turning Page link. And if you turn the pages, you'll find on, say, page 7, signatures of Winston Churchill, page 30, Ernest Shackleton. And we did uncover several prominent women contributors, but of course, many more women's stories do not appear in these archives. But we wanted to celebrate their significance too. So I want to turn to a couple of slides covering 4 women who I'm selecting as the sort of hidden half of the story, or her story, specifically from this attendance book. So May French Sheldon is the first. She's an American author and explorer. She travelled from London to Africa unaccompanied to explore Lake Chala and published a book on this. When she presented a paper to the Tyneside Geographical Society on 4th of March, 1887, it was read out by a man. Although she was present, but it was read out by a man. It's unclear whether this was because of her insecurities regarding her accent, or because of her gender. There's very little written historically about May French Sheldon, but apparently, although widely travelled, she was very much still in the shadow of the men who went before her and around her. So interestingly, I should have probably mentioned as well that the Tyneside Geographical Society was actually quite pioneering in having women contributing to this popular lecture series, because back in London, the Royal Geographical Society, which is the more famous society of geography at the time, had a parallel set of stories and conflicts, actually, what they called the lady question, which is, should the society admit women at all as fellows? And they didn't until, I'm trying to work out what it was, lost my place, but anyway, 1928, I think. It was sort of, I'll come back to that. But they allowed women to speak, but in a very much in a kind of guest presence, whereas the Tyneside Geographical Society appeared to actually have invited speakers, women speakers. So, for instance, Josephine Dibitch-Peary was an Arctic explorer and writer. As with many of these women, her exploring was very much as the companion to her husband, who was a better known explorer. But Josephine was a formidable woman. She travelled alongside her husband on many of his expeditions and gave birth to their first daughter while in Greenland. And whilst intrepid in terms of travelling alongside her husband, she did publish in her own right, gave lectures on her travels. And through her work, she developed her own strand of voice. But this has been very much overshadowed by her husband's fame and achievements. And this is a kind of recurring theme. And this is why, sadly, the archives are so slender in terms of getting a hook into. Most of these publications are no longer available. But Grace, an intern, went down to London, to London School of Economics, actually, where there's the women's library, and she explored some of these women's publications and things, and got as much information as we could. But we really got the sense that these women were going to be permanently overshadowed in terms of the details of their work, because it wasn't on the historical record. So the best we can do is to claim them as a sort of her story, which will possibly never be told, but which can be celebrated all the same. And similarly, we go on to Alicia Buick-Little. She was also an author and a scholar, and she not only was a passionate traveller and explorer. Geography was very much interpreted through expeditions at this time. Of course, it was running parallel with the idea of kind of colonization and kind of claiming parts of the world. But Alicia was very unusual in terms of being a very early social justice campaigner and potentially critiquing this colonial story. She didn't go as far as to sort of criticize the sort of imperial expeditions and military claiming here, but she was passionate campaigner against foot binding when she traveled through the Yangtze Gorges of China. And she gave lectures to several societies, including the Tyneside Geographical Society, on this. So she was beginning to start to be, you know, very much a woman who I would admire and follow in this in terms of the activism. So geography wasn't a discipline to describe the world or to sort of be ethnocentrically point to different cultures in a kind of anthropological way. And it was actually to question and probe why inequalities existed and why that there was poverty and oppression, particularly the oppression of women and girls. So you can see why I'm claiming and recovering the particular women that I am. And that takes us to Mary Sheepshanks, who's possibly one of the most interesting characters of this quartet that I've selected. Because Mary Sheepshanks, her life differed to the other women who spoke at the Tyneside Geographical Society, because this isn't just a story of gender, it's also a story of race and class. And you've probably already picked up the idea that the women who I've mentioned previously were very privileged. They were privileged to be able to travel. They had the affluence and resources, but they were also permitted by being seen to be accompanied by a husband or to be, you know, a helpmate. And therefore, they weren't considered to be being transgressive or deviant by traveling and publishing on their findings. Whereas Mary Sheepshanks grew up in, she had 16 siblings. She was born in Liverpool, the daughter of an Anglican bishop, of a pretty grim childhood of poverty, also a very, very strong parochial norms of and sanctions on what a woman could or couldn't do or expect of life. And she had 16 siblings, and her childhood is said to have been bleak. I find it very interesting, and I don't have an explanation for this, but she did go to study at Cambridge. And that itself seems to be an astonishing rupture from this idea of being held back and told that she, you know, wouldn't amount to anything, and that she was just one of this sort of, her life was to sort of one of drudgery. And at Cambridge, she met Bertrand Russell, and she was enthralled to his progressive ideas, and to others that she heard and read about at the time. And it was actually through conversations with Bertrand Russell that led her to reject the religious faith that she was raised in. She embraced atheism. She embraced the suffragist movement, the non-violent version of it. She very much was for women's emancipation. And her advanced views on politics, feminism, and religion led to her family rejecting her. So after the First World War, she left England to stay with her brother in Uruguay. And it's from this time that she explored much of South America unaccompanied. And this is what's astonishing, unaccompanied, to survey the social and economic conditions that she found there. She really was pretty transgressive, and she was very much an early pioneer for sort of women's liberation. Upon her return to England in 1924, she conducted a lecture tour which included the Tyneside Geographical Society in 1925. So there we have a sort of quartet of hidden half of the story of the popular lectures of the Tyneside Geographical Society. And there were other women, there are some others that features in the little booklet. But given that there are hundreds and hundreds of signatures in the attendance book, if you get to turn the page, hundreds and hundreds, and most of the signatures are of the speaker, but a lot of them are also of the kind of society representatives who would take the speaker off to dinner afterwards. I mean, societies have operated the same, I think. They were all men of military class, of government, civil servants. There's a story of gender, class, and politics in that book. So these women, they're not even a half of the story, they're a fragment of the story, and that we've pulled them out. But I want to turn now to consider the origins of geography at Newcastle University, because there's another unsung hero, and that is Margaret Tyrrell. And it's a story that's, I mean, it's really a story that's so local and so of, I suppose you could say, of parochial interest. But I've been passionate about claiming the story of Margaret Tyrrell and her role in the early development of geography at, oops, the battery's running low. Do I have to, nothing being plugged in. Oh yes, there we go. Because Margaret Tyrrell, I'll jump to the sort of takeaway message here. In my view, Margaret Tyrrell sort of pretty much she single-handedly ran the geography department in 1928 for the first year of its delivering a full honours degree. And the reason being is that an illustrious professor, actually who hadn't even got his doctorate yet from University College London, who was then playing Mr. Henry Daish. He'd been appointed, but he couldn't take up his position to head the department in 1928. He couldn't come until a year later. So Miss Tyrrell, who was the daughter of a geology professor at University of Glasgow, was appointed sort of just to hold the fort for this, until this Don came in from London. And what galls me is that the building I work in today is called the Henry Daish Building. And, you know, poor Margaret Tyrrell, who for a year, she basically set up a lecture, you know, pending the arrival of and she was 22 years old. Mr. Henry Daish at the time was 29. So there wasn't a huge age difference, but there was a massive status difference. So Margaret, age 22, having never lectured before, but having studied geology and geography broadly in Glasgow, was asked to run the department on her own, to sit on Senate, which for anyone who knows is quite a serious undertaking, and to teach all the courses not being taught by the geologists from a sort of civil engineering department at the time. I mean, this was a small department, small by what it is today, but the number of students more than trebled over this period, number 15 in 1929, 30. So she helped lay the foundations of a curriculum, combining a core of regional geography courses, cartography, surveying, and she conducted, she set up a module of regional dissertations. So she designed the regional dissertations and supervised all the students doing their dissertations. So once Henry Daish was in charge, he was very respectful of Margaret's having helped, you know, designed the curriculum, and he moved to elevate Margaret to the status of full-time lecturer. And by all accounts, they did work well together for that first year. And this was at a time when the department was housed in a dilapidated wooden army hut, dating from the First World War, when Armstrong College had been turned into a military hospital. So from personal archives that we found, and we did find letters and whatever referring to Margaret, she was apparently assigned a tiny room in this complex of wooden huts that was too dirty to work in. So she painted the walls herself, distempered the walls white herself, much to the consternation of male colleagues who apparently thought such practical work was unbecoming of an academic, but then they weren't really quite accepting her as an academic anyway. It seems to have been a very sort of uneasy settlement between the early academics joining the department. So as I say, today, a massive building is named after Henry Dage. And so at every opportunity, I try to salvage a picture of, and we don't really have, I was just thinking whether I didn't show a picture. Oops, no, I'll go back for the, there is a picture, a picture, a little group picture of Margaret Tyrrell only walking with others in her family. It's very hard to find any story about her at all, but at every opportunity I do try to sort of talk about the fact that it should really be Margaret Tyrrell who's celebrated. There are many further stories about other hidden figures of geography at Newcastle, but I'll point to the booklet for those, and you're welcome to take a copy. And there is an online version of this on the department website, as well as the Turning Pages link. So what I want to do in the last sort of 10 minutes or so is I just want to turn to the reasons why the oversights of history remain of such contemporary significance, because I don't want to, I mean, there's some of the stories about the hidden figures that I've selected can sound so outrageous, so misogynistic, so patriarchal, so that we consign them to the depths of history. But we have to remind ourselves that there are some really persistent and enduring inequities and misrepresentations of expertise, knowledge, and ideas. So critically exposing the past in our aspirations for equality and diversity in geography education, and I mean that's something that I do in my teaching, but also in terms of, as a place to work, we get involved with a kind of equality, diversity, inclusion policies about workplace, an ethic of care. So there's these ideas are in our education, in our research, and also in our administration and leadership. And I just pulled up an example of the fact that some of the explorers for the Tyneside Geographical Society focused on Antarctica and the wild continent of snow, ice, and there. And the early pioneers, such as Alicia Buick and that, were very much out of keeping. And even still, women in Antarctica are a rarity. But I have got colleagues today who go out into with a British Antarctica survey, and so it is now. Changes have taken place, but at the same time, we can't take for granted that there's a kind of steady progress towards greater parity of esteem or gender equality. There is what undeniably is a sort of male stream history in a lot of our gold standard heritage. I'm talking here about National Trust and English heritage and the like. And a good example of this, and I don't know, some of you might remember this, relatively recently, the same year that we had our 90th celebrations of geography, Cragside invited a couple of artists from Newcastle University, it's just by coincidence really, Kate Stobbart and Harriet Sutcliffe. They made a temporary intervention within the Victorian art collection at Cragside, and they called it the Great Cragside Cover-Up. And the aim was to encourage visitors to notice the absence of the female voice by covering up male artworks to celebrate overlooked female representation. So there was most of the portraits and the statues were covered up because most of them were men. And so the one or two exceptions, the exceptional sort of presence was brought to the foreground. There was a huge backlash at the time, and Cragside and National Trust got a lot of criticism, as you can see in this newspaper headline, and there was a little online survey about whether the National Trust, whether it's wrong to cover up objects. I mean, it was a mixed feelings in terms of whether this was helpful or not. But as you can see with newspaper headlines and online surveys, visitors were baffled at what they saw as censorship, but they weren't necessarily, you know, there was also sense that this shouldn't be a reason to sort of not try to pursue this form of education. There's certainly, I mean, there's been projects further to at Newcastle University looking at how to introduce further interventions in heritage, such as, and indeed, the National Trust then introduced this publication called Women in Power. It was a conference and then a publication to redress the balance of missing voices, to introduce a sense of history and heritage that could be curated in ways to encourage visitors to critically reflect on absences and overlooked heritage as much as those things that were curated to be the main story, the main highlights. So the Cragside cover-up is among a continuous program of initiatives to redress the balance of women in power in this sector. And as you can see, it's sort of an ongoing project. But I wanted to sort of point then to other examples of ongoing initiatives, because in some ways, I suppose the shock was the National Trust is considered to be really quite small c conservative in terms of its approach. And I suppose more flamboyantly, there have been some recent efforts to introduce or to audit the underrepresentation of women in public statues. For instance, just going to jump ahead slightly here, but here in Denmark, there's the idea that out of 2,500 statues, someone did an audit of statues in Denmark, 28 are of women. And so to sort of make this point, all the statues, or in a large public part, white pillars were introduced to represent each of the 28 women in the country. Sort of making a point in terms of the missing statues of women. So those 28 were standing for so many more that were missing from public spaces, the public narrative, from what the national identity and the Danish place in the world was being represented to be. And so it is in the UK that there's been this new initiative, which is the Public Statues and Sculptures Association, PSSA, and it's got an online presence, you can explore it. There's just 100 sculptures of women recorded so far. I think it is growing all the time, and the vast majority of those are religious and allegorical figures. So contemporary women, or women from the 19th century, from the archive period that I've been studying here, are very few in number. I pulled out a couple from a region here. We've got Dolly Peel, we've got Emily Wilding Davidson, and we've got a new one, not in the northeast. This was one that it was down in Sussex, is of Greta Thunberg. And it's nice to think that if we really do take seriously the voices and the activism and the influence of women today, that we should be having these influential voices signified in our public statuary. So that's kind of where I've taken you on this this talk, and I kind of want to wrap up there by really concluding by the fact that I think we do need, no society is immune to this, really, such as your own and the Mining Institute. We really need an activist feminist history, heritage and education. We need to not let the history settle in the past. We need to go back and pick over it and uncover the gaps, the silences. And it's very interesting to know that locally and across the region, there are some pockets of activism and efforts to, for instance, introduce alternative sort of blue plaques. Certainly the Quaker movement and organisation and funding has been uncovering some influential Quakers, such as the Dodd sisters. There have been plaques introduced for the story of the suffragette movement here in Newcastle. and so on and so on. This is a tiny kind of little, crack in the crack of light in the rich tapestry of this historical record. So we do need to do much more of this. Diversity issues persist in my subject, in geography, and probably archaeology and anthropology and history as well. And a socially responsible public education. I mean, I'm an educator. I teach undergraduates and postgraduates and interns and that, but I also believe in public pedagogy, and that is that our education isn't just to qualify with degrees and things. It is actually to increase the content and the provocations of a kind of public inquiry, and societies such as yours can play a part in that, to have a critical vision of public values and what should signify, for instance, our cultural heritage. Archival activism, we've got a radical geographers movement here in Newcastle, and it takes activism to make change in culture and society, even if it comes to who gets invited to speak at lecture series like these, for instance, and about what topics. And I also believe very much in heritage from below, a grassroots heritage, so that we can marry Sheepshanks and others who are, maybe of working class heritage, who are silenced often by considered to be not being part of the official history. The heritage from below allows us to contest oppression in civic landscapes, not just in terms of statuary, but also in terms of our art galleries, museums, and heritage, and how these are represented widely. So I'll stop there because that's kind of the story I came to tell.